Today, on this episode of Going Deeper, you kind of get a bonus episode because while we may be a little bit ahead of our actual schedule today, we're going to go ahead and release our podcast on the Crucifixion of Jesus today, which is Good Friday, so that before Easter, you can listen to this and you can get yourself prepared for next week's readings on the Crucifixion of Jesus. I'm your host, Kyle McCaskill.
I'm Becky Clark.
Chris Winterman.
So join us as we go deeper. Okay, so jumping right in, it's really, I feel like it's not really appropriate to kind of, come into this all happy-go-lucky and lighthearted and everything. I'm sure we're going to laugh and chuckle a few times this morning, but we're talking about the crucifixion of Jesus, which is, if it's an easy topic for you to discuss, then I don't know.
You're probably not looking at it authentically.
That's a good way to put it, yeah. So probably a little nicer than I would have put it.
Yeah. Yeah.
But we are that time of the year, that time in the church season even, when this is what we're dealing with. And it's heavy, weighty, difficult things to talk about because just talking about the crucifixion of Jesus forces us to admit things about our own selves that we'd probably prefer not to have to admit. And I know, Becky, this is actually one of your favorite places of study in the New Testament.
It is. Does that sound weird?
Is that
a weird thing?
A little morbid.
It doesn't sound weird to me, though, because to me, it's that paradox of what Jesus came to do. It's, taking something gruesome and terrible and making something beautiful out of it.
Yeah, this is the culmination. The readings for this week, and I will say this, I kind of feel like it's a little bit unfortunate that our readings for this week, the people who designed this actually don't ask us to read the actual crucifixion account with the beatings. The readings that we have in Matthew and in Luke don't reference as much as John and all that other stuff. We just don't do the readings where it talks a lot about the flogging and all that kind of stuff. And while those are not the fun passages, I believe that they are essential for the people of God to kind of come back to, because what Jesus went through and the humiliation and the pain was for us.
Yeah.
And he didn't have to, because at any point, starting from where we start in our Monday's readings of when Judas meets him in the garden, and even before that, we don't read that he goes to the garden and is in anguish and he prays to the Father, to God the Father. Like, they're just it is a dark time for us to have to remember of what God has done for us and why Jesus came.
That's a good choice of words, a dark time. So this is giving veracity to John's statement in some of the very first readings of this whole thing.
Yeah.
That Jesus is the light of the world, and the darkness has not, cannot, will not overcome / extinguish it.
Yeah.
Right.
And this is the moment when that is put to the test.
Yeah.
Because that statement, it doesn't do any good if everything is rosy and everything goes just in a nice, neat little way.
Yeah.
Right.
So this is the time when Jesus could have given in to hatred. This is the time when he could have called down, as he said in his own words, however many legions of angels.
Yeah.
Yes.
This is the time when he could have said, you know what? No, I'm going to do what I want to do.
Yeah. And it's interesting because I am going to do a quick, quasi-commercial for our Holy Land trip here, because if you stand on the top of the Mount of Olives, where the Garden of Gethsemane is, and you're looking down to Jerusalem, it's really not that far.
Nope.
I mean,
not far at all.
If I remember when we walked down that road, obviously it's a slightly different road today than it was in that day, but it took us 10 or 15 minutes to get from the top all the way to the bottom.
Yeah, I think I played 2 worship songs.
Yeah.
That was me and a few people listened to some specific worship songs as we walked down. And I think 2 or so.
So this is something that, to me, when somebody mentioned this to me, and then I got to see it for myself, I thought, okay, wow. So just on the other side of the hill, you just go up on the other side of the hill, it's the Judean wilderness. And Jesus is standing up there. It's at nighttime. So these guys are coming with torches and whatever so they can see where they're going.
That's right.
So Jesus is watching the arrest party
from a far distance.
From a far distance, yes. And just seeing them walk all the way up the hill. And 2 minutes and Jesus is in a place where they'll never find him.
Yep.
All he has to do is turn around, walk over the hill. He's gone forever.
Well, and he could have easily blended into the amount of people who were camped as well outside of Jerusalem because this is Passover. So thousands of Jews have also come to celebrate Passover because if you were a good Jew and you could travel, you went to Jerusalem. So yes, not only could he get in the wilderness, but he could easily hide through the amount of people too, and be gone.
Yeah.
And none of this would have happened.
Right.
But none of this would have happened, you know?
And we never would have gotten to it is finished.
Correct. We never would have gotten there. So, I think that's one of the things we don't know too much about or think about. You know, the area of everything that happens in these readings for this week are all in this short little space of area. So Jesus sees them coming from a super long distance when he knows they're coming, and he knows that Judas is leading them, right? Who he just had a meal with and celebrated Passover. And then that he's going to go down to Caiaphas's house, which is not very far from where he is. And then he eventually goes to Pilate's house, to Pilate's, place. And then from Pilate's place, he goes to to Golgotha, which is also, maybe they think they're like a third of a mile away, something like that.
It was just outside the old city gates is where they think it was.
Right. So everything really happens in this short amount of distance places. And all of these crowds are witnessing all of the things that are happening because all of the people who are camped outside of town are watching all of these authorities and people come up with all these torches and wondering what the heck is going on as they arrest Jesus. They walk him back down to Caiaphas's house, and there's a big crowd because we know it because it's recorded, and that's where Peter's situation happens in this courtyard where there's a ton of people, which again, remember, this is a huge high time in Jerusalem. So it's just overcrowded with people. And I think that's kind of the neat thing about the story is that it's not done in seclusion in any way, shape, or form. It's done smack dab in the midst of all of these people to witness it, and who have been there. And just as a reference back, days before, we're celebrating his entry into Jerusalem and laying their cloaks down, saying basically, we kind of recognize you as the king, and Hosanna in the highest, and who has come but the king, our King David to save us. And days later, chanting.
Crucify
him, which we haven't even got to yet, but
right.
So it is by far one of my favorite passages to read and to study because there's so much that happens in these passages, and there's so much prophecy that is fulfilled, and there is so much beauty in the midst of pain, because without his death, then there would not be a resurrection. But without his death, there's no taking of our sin. There had to be a death, and so he dies. And one of the other things about these passages for this week is the beautiful show, to me, the parallel between Jesus' humanity and his lordship as well. You see a lot of his humanity in the garden. You see a lot of his pain. And again, we don't read that passage for this week, but you see a lot of his pain and anguish, but also his submission that we're called to do as well, right? But then you see how he could have what you said. He could have called down legions of archangels to, and he could have called God to stop it at any point, and he's God, so he could have done it. And yet the submission of allowing and humility just to be, but the pain.
Yeah.
Not just submission, though, still actively reaching out, praying for their forgiveness, reaching out to the thief beside him.
Yeah.
I mean, even in the hardest, darkest moments, Christ is still the good shepherd.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's such a great reflection of why Jesus matters today. I mean, especially today. Over the last couple of years, we've faced things that have only happened once a decade, all at once. We've faced public health crisis like the 19-teens. We've faced economic crisis, not to the level of the Depression of the 20s, but close enough.
It's significant.
It's significant.
Yeah.
And we've faced political unrest like the 60s, all within a span of like 2 years.
Yeah.
So the weight and the darkness feels like it's just closing in on so many people. But because we can look at the weight of the darkness at the crucifixion, Christ persevered. And now we can, if you were to fast forward, greater is he that's within us, Christ through the Holy Spirit,
Yeah.
than he that's within the world, saying, okay, you can make it. He made it. So with him, you can make it.
Yeah.
And I think that's something people need to hear.
Oh, absolutely. There's a lot of in the midst of the darkness here that we read this week. That's where we find that hope to keep going.
Yeah, it's everywhere in the story for this week too. Just the remnants and reminders of it. And then to know that at the end of it, because obviously we were on the other side of death and resurrection of Christ, that there is hope, continued hope that has always been there.
Right.
But hope that doesn't short circuit or circumvent the struggle, the pain,
Yeah.
the darkness. That's one of the things I've heard from people outside the faith is, well, Christians, you just pretend and you're pie in the sky and everything's going to be fine and you just ignore reality. Nothing could be further from the truth.
Right.
Christianity is the reality because of what Christ endured.
Yeah.
And the temptation for Christians, don't fast forward through all of this to get to Easter Sunday. Because in life, you can't fast forward through the grief and through the pain and through the darkness. And frankly, it's pain and darkness a lot of times that comes upon us not by our choosing or making.
Right.
And we feel completely helpless in the midst of it. But don't fast forward it. Find the hope within it, like Christ did. And know that perseverance will lead you to resurrection. It may be Friday, but Sunday's on the way.
That's right.
Well, and I think maybe this is one reason that the church had created the tradition of celebrating Lent, of instituting this idea of Lent and the preparation of your heart, that there's the darkness you kind of have to walk through. There's the pain, there's the giving up, there's the sacrifice, and how you do that. One of the things that Jesus shows in the last hours of his life is this beautiful, constant humility that he doesn't rail at them. He could have. I mean, in our humanity, don't we want to rail at somebody who causes us pain and
we probably would have
anguish?
said he should have. Like we would feel like not only is he justified, that would have been he should do that.
Right. But he endures, and he does it with this beautiful, graceful humility. But suffering is part of, if you don't endure some suffering, how do you know what's really good in the end, right? So the whole idea of Lent, instituted as a tradition within the church, is to place ourselves in a time of endurance, a time of sacrifice, and how we then learn to handle that better, and also to prepare ourselves for the fact that what Jesus did for us was all of those things. We are called to die to ourselves, so it's a practice of it and a reminder of it, and then then to get to the Sunday. But that's why we do Holy Week too, is that's the continued reminder of you don't just celebrate resurrection on Sunday without having sat through the death on Friday.
Yeah. Well, and we even see echoes of this if we think back to or forward to Advent, when the beginning of Advent is a waiting period. When we talk about that Isaiah passage of the people who walked in darkness have seen a great light, they had to be in darkness before they could understand what the light was.
Right.
And so there's these echoes throughout all of it that you have to go through the bad to understand the good.
In literature, they talk about the hero's journey, and it's a template, it's a formula.
Right.
The hero has to feel the call to the journey. They have to go through these different things, these various stages, and one of the stages is the struggle, the suffering, and without that, they're not the hero. They don't fully become the hero until that. And Christ was the hero from the beginning. However, throughout his ministry, he made it a point to let people know, not for self-aggrandizement, but to point to the glory of the Father, to let them know this is who I am. And I think at the crucifixion, the one incident, the one statement, one line of dialogue sums all this up. You have one of the centurions standing there. I believe it's in John's gospel. And in the movie, the greatest story ever told is this guy's played by John Wayne. So he's the only centurion with like a Midwestern accent, but that's okay. But this centurion looks and says, "Surely this was the Son of God."
Yeah,
and it's incredible to me that the occupying Roman forces, that someone would see all of this evidence and say, yeah, this is it. And disheartening that what John said earlier in his gospel, but the light came and his own people not only didn't recognize him, they outright rejected him.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So there's so much going on here that you really could spend, and Becky said this earlier, you could spend 6 podcasts, episodes, just on this one incident. Because it is so deep and rich.
Yep. So what do you want to highlight? What do you want to talk about then? What do we need to talk more about in regard to it?
I don't know. I was just going to defer to you on this, because I know you've got tons of notes.
I do.
There.
I have oodles and oodles of notes, and I really don't know how to kind of whittle it down to bites that fits in like 25 minutes. So, and we've already taken up some of that with such good, rich conversation already. So, okay. So I guess maybe there's a few things that I want to highlight as just kind of some historical information to help paint a better picture of what we're reading then.
Yeah.
Okay. So when we talk about when Jesus when the Sanhedrin comes to take Jesus and they put him on trial, maybe there's a few things that we need to know about the Sanhedrin and about the Roman government that will be helpful in regard to what the Sanhedrin is doing and why they take him to Pilate.
Yeah.
So, the Sanhedrin is the Jewish governing body, and the Roman government allows the Sanhedrin to exist, essentially, to kind of, it's not necessarily a partnership, but it's a partnership in the sense of like the Romans kind of say, well, if we give them some space to self-govern to an extent, then they're happier. Yes. They're more compliant.
As long as they pay taxes and follow our big laws.
Correct. So the Sanhedrin gets to take care of the Jewish laws and the Jewish people. So they want to get rid of Jesus. They're ticked at Jesus. He's done too many things. He's kind of made them look stupid. People are starting to question him.
They made themselves look stupid.
And he's creating this following. And unfortunately, a lot of the Jewish leaders, not all, so this is a very blanket statement, but a lot of the Jewish leaders had gotten to a point where power had become a motivator.
Well,
power, authority, money, all that kind of stuff.
We talked about last week with Marie and Doug on last week's episode about how so many of the leaders had basically become cultural Jews instead of actually wanting to follow God.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that's at play here. We see the effects of that playing out in this narrative here.
And what an indictment for some of the modern day church too. Cultural Christians, and the question is, would we have the same response to Jesus that those leaders had?
Well, and
yes,
and
that's a painful question to answer. That probably maybe like we're being honest.
We talked about it last week too, where Doug mentioned the trying to put new wine in old wineskins, and to be careful with that.
Yeah. So the Sanhedrin, this group of people, are just threatened. They're very threatened at this point. They don't know what to do. They can't excommunicate Jesus. They can't get him to shut up, and so they need to get rid of him. And so they had made this plan with Judas. I'm not really sure in some ways why they did. I mean, they would have found another way to arrest him. That's always kind of a question for me, why they had to have one of the inside people with Jesus to make an arrest. Because they pull out false testimony from all other places. They don't pull it from Judas. So I don't know. Maybe ultimately it just interestingly fulfills prophecy in some way. And that's how it had to work. But they need to put him on trial. But ultimately, he doesn't need to necessarily be on trial with the Jewish council. He needs to be on trial with the Romans.
Yeah.
The Jewish Sanhedrin cannot have someone killed.
Right.
So
much less crucified, which is a step above regular execution.
And
crucifixion was a Roman punishment.
It was a horrible, horrible Roman punishment.
And it was reserved only for specific crimes.
Yes.
And if you were a Roman citizen, you couldn't be crucified except under the most stringent of circumstances. So this is a big deal.
Yeah. So and one of the things that's important about the Sanhedrin is, I know I've gone back to it a few times already, it's the Passover.
Yeah.
So there are so many Jews that are in town, and the Sanhedrin has to walk very carefully because they do not want to distance themselves any more from the rest of the Jewish people. They need the Jewish people to continue to be on their side so they can continue to have power and authority. So they cannot kill Jesus, and they need to be somewhat distanced from the Roman government who kills Jesus.
That sounds like the answer to your query about why it had to be one of his followers, because if they just busted in and grabbed him, the accusation could be made, well, you're just intimidated by him, etc. Whereas if one of his own followers turns him in, then their hands are somewhat clean in the arrest, at least. Right.
Someone who's been following very closely for the past 3 years agrees that there is something fishy, very fishy about this whole thing.
My speculation is with a lot of the scholars that think that Judas wasn't so much trying to sell Jesus out as he was trying to force Jesus's hand as this warrior Messiah, thinking, if they come to arrest him, he will probably react and be the Messiah he's supposed to be.
Yeah, there's interesting speculation about why Judas is motivated to do what he does. And most people, most commentaries that I've read in the end kind of say, well, here's a guess, but we'll just never know.
Nobody knows for sure. Yeah.
We'll never know. Judas hung himself with the answer to that, which is a painful thing. Yeah. But So the most that the Jewish people, the Sanhedrins, can really accuse Jesus of at this point on their part is blasphemy. Blasphemy of the Holy Spirit. Blasphemy that he He claims he's God, although he never directly says it. If you read any of the accounts, well, there's one account, I think it's in Mark.
Until he uses the I am.
Mm-hmm.
That was with Pilate, right? I think that's with Pilate.
No, that was with the Sanhedrin, because
right.
that was when they said,
right.
We've got him. We don't need any more witnesses. He's just said it.
Right. So, but I don't think that's in the accounts that we read. I think
probably not.
I think it's in either Mark, because we don't read Mark or John this week. So yeah, he, interestingly, in our readings, he just says, that's what you say.
Right.
Which has got to be so frustrating, you know?
That sounds that's like what one of my kids would say to the other one. Like, that's what you say.
That's right.
Well, I mean, we do see in the Matthew 26 chapter that Jesus replies to the people, you have said it yourself.
Right, right.
Yeah.
We do read that.
Because some of the people were saying just days before, who I am.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And he also does say it to Pilate. It is as you say.
It is as you say. It's not, you know, like there's a slight fakeness to it. You know, it's like I'm copping to it, but I'm not kind of thing.
Well,
which has to be somewhat frustrating.
And that may be the comment that really Pilate was like, you do whatever you want with him, because Pilate was asking him, do you consider yourself the king of the Jews? Which,
well, Pilate tried to give Jesus this whole, I've got the power to set you free or let you, or send you to be executed, so you need to answer. And Jesus looks at him and says, you don't have any power over me.
Yeah.
The power you think you have has been given to you. But see, I think Jesus is not standing up and claiming it explicitly, is in line with his whole nature and expressions of submission to the Father, and Paul's theology later about him laying aside it and not considering this something to be grasped. So this is his humility. He will not stand up and claim that until the resurrection. When he says all authority, like he is being consistent with who he was and what he was there to do.
Right. So, when he goes to Pilate, and it's sunrise when the Sanhedrin takes him to Pilate, which is actually a normal time for Roman governors to preside over a case. So we're doing everything that is historically accurate in the story, and the Sanhedrins are doing it. They're going by the book, essentially, right? So they meet with Pilate at sunrise, because that's when testimony and trials happen. And they basically say to Pilate, he's telling people not to pay taxes to Caesar, which was a big deal, not to pay taxes. Although he never says that, actually, because that's a lie.
Whose picture's on the coin?
That's right. That's not what Jesus says. And that he is proclaiming himself to be a king of the Jews, which could cause insurrection. The only king is Caesar. And anyone who declares themselves king over Caesar is to be killed, because Caesar is the only king. So these are two things that are offenses in the Roman times.
And they're setting Pilate up.
They are.
Because they know that Pilate has to respond to these. And Pilate doesn't even want to execute him, much less crucify him.
Right.
However, you have this historical background of this extremely difficult area to govern. And the idea is that Pilate has been warned, look, if you don't take care of this, it's going to be your head.
Right. Yeah.
So Pilate feels backed into a corner here, although Pilate's not let off the hook. The discussion with his wife is very interesting. He asks, what is truth?
Yep.
And his wife says, if you don't know what truth is, I can't tell you.
Yeah.
And that's another microcosm of this whole thing. People standing in the face of truth, Christ, truth personified, and yet still denying it.
Yeah. So his hands are tied in a lot of ways. He's kind of stuck, and he's in Jerusalem very specifically because it's the Passover. He's got to keep peace among all of the Jewish people, and he needs to do the right thing to make sure that there's no other issues. So he gets kind of stuck. I mean, and you see the struggle in the story of he's trying to help in some ways for like, help me out, man. Like, help me out.
Yeah.
I could deal with you, but in a lesser way, and feel like that I have satisfied everybody and there will be no further issue.
But he also chooses Barabbas as the alternative.
Yes.
Hoping that Barabbas is so filthy and just repugnant that they'll say, okay, no, obviously. But then they're like, no, give us Barabbas.
Yeah.
Who's just a maniacal monster. I mean, this guy's awful.
He's actually leading insurrections, actually murdering people.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
Oh, but he's the good guy.
He's doing actually everything that the Sanhedrin is claiming that Jesus is doing or is, getting ready to do, but he actually did it.
What an incredible metaphor, because our adversary, our accuser, claims the things that we've done, and we have. We are Barabbas. And yet Christ willingly takes that on. So again, even in the midst of this, there is this incredible intentionality to show what is happening.
Yeah.
And the message could be no clearer to me.
Yeah, and and what didn't work in the Sanhedrin's favor, although I think they thought it would, was they beat him and Jesus and kind of did some things before they brought him to Pilate, and they made him look more humble and all that kind of stuff. I think, and probably in their minds thinking, we're going to make this guy look like we've beat him down, but he deserves death. Well, then compared to Barabbas, he does look like he's pretty pathetic. And why would you choose then to send Jesus to the cross? As a side note of what's going on between Jesus and Barabbas is historically, during the Passover, the Romans would make this gesture in the time of Passover in Jerusalem to release one captive that was a Jew, as kind of in favor of the time of what you're celebrating, and it was an echo of Egypt. Right. So the Roman government is kind of like making this nice gesture. So this is not an unusual thing to have happened.
Right.
And Pilate is like, he thinks, whoa, this could help me out. This could save me. We've got to take care of this thing anyway. I'll pick this guy who obviously the crowd would choose to go ahead and crucify and be in place.
Right.
Look at Jesus. It just looks pathetic at this point. They're not going to choose him. So placed up against each other, and yet the Sanhedrin had just stirred the crowd to such an extent and whispered in their ears, just as happens to us a lot of times, as sin whispers into our ears, and we buy it. We buy it. And so they call out, no. Release the guy who's been murdering and is crazy and filthy and all that kind of stuff, and take the humble guy and give him by far the worst death that anybody could ever imagine. And Pilate can do nothing at that point. He's got to do what he's got to do because he's got a big city to take care of. Yeah. But I'm tempted to empathize with Pilate. I'm tempted to offer sympathy as well to him. But at the end of the day, you're responsible for your own choices. And I think the blood of the martyrs testifies against Pilate. I think the blood of the martyrs says, look, you can't put personal comfort above truth.
Yeah.
Right. Well, so that's one of the things about this, what we see with a group of people in this story, the Sanhedrin, who should have been the people who recognized Jesus for who he is.
Yeah.
Are the ones that completely turn their backs and want him dead.
Well, they were so caught up in their own business and their own searching for power that they just flat out missed God.
So you go back to Jesus talking about the unforgivable sin.
We talked about that last week. Yeah.
So and I haven't heard that episode yet, but I'm thinking this is what it is. I don't think they missed God. I think some of them looked God in the face, recognized, and said,
and turned around.
No thanks.
that's the only sin that can't be forgiven, because you are denying the only means by which forgiveness can be obtained.
Yeah, exactly.
And by doing that, there's no way to forgive. There's no means by which. That's like saying, I'm hungry, well, here's food. No, I'm not going to eat anything.
Yeah.
Well, there's no other way for that to happen. So and that's what's the scariest thing to me, is that I think some of these leaders looked at Jesus, knew who he was, and said, no.
But we have an interesting story of one of them who was a part of the whole trial and everything like that. And we don't know how he felt about it, except that once Jesus has been crucified and breathes his last, he goes to Pilate and says, let me have his body. And he's one of the Sanhedrin.
Yeah.
He's one of the priests who who looked at Jesus, and probably my assumption is maybe he was unsure, or maybe he voted against and there weren't enough votes and he lost.
Yeah. Joseph of Arimathea.
That's right. But he recognizes. And so he asked to take Jesus and to bury him in the respectable way, giving him the honor that he deserves. And he's one of the ones who sat in that trial.
Yeah.
Isn't there someone that actually speaks up in the trial, though, and they ask him, what if you too become one of his followers? I'm thinking this could have been that guy. I can't give you chapter and verse or even which gospel, but I remember that someone saying, "Look, this may not be what we need to do here."
Well, we need to go back then,
and they said,
read the gospel accounts.
Yeah.
It could be possible, and then he may be the one.
Mark or John. Yeah.
But for Pilate's sake, in the point that you're bringing up about Pilate, he recognizes something about Jesus because he tries, and he goes back to the people and is like, I just don't see anything. I don't see what you're seeing. Like he doesn't seem like, this doesn't seem like a big deal, and I want to save you. And they have a conversation, but you're right. Ultimately he makes a decision whether he's back in the corner or not. But he sees something that the others choose not to see or don't see, of the people who should have, right? And then we also we already mentioned the Centurion, which is, again, another Gentile that you think...
Gentile should have had no clue.
No clue.
And that's an indictment. And let me throw a disclaimer here. So Pilate washes his hands, and the Jewish leaders say, let his blood be on us and on our children, etc. Right. That has been abhorrently used to justify anti-Semitism throughout the years. And that's deplorable. Yeah. And that should not happen. I've heard that utilized to do that.
Oh, wow.
And that's just awful. That's not the intention here. The idea is not that the Jewish people are cursed or Christ killers. That's just foolishness. But there's a lot of truth to what you're saying, Becky, that these are the people that should have recognized him. As a matter of fact, Jesus doesn't tell the disciples that they're allowed to go and preach to the Gentiles until after the resurrection.
Yeah.
The whole ministry before that.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, there's a Gentile woman, a Canaanite woman, that comes up to him and he's like, look, I'm here for the children of Israel first.
Right.
Yeah.
So, and that's one of those, did we cover that in any podcasts? I haven't seen them. That very interesting conversation.
Yeah.
Look.
I would say while you're looking, one of the things it reminds me of, and then I want to make two other points, is, when the people take the promised land in Joshua, there's the Rahab. And at the time, the promised land was to be obviously for the people of God. Yet God makes concession in the law that if a Gentile recognizes me and sets aside all other things to follow and to then be grafted into the Jewish family, there's opportunity for that. And that's what happens to Rahab and her family, right? So even at that point, and this is kind of an echo of it, like it was always the intent for all people. And
back
God,
to Abraham.
Right.
Yeah. All nations.
All nations, all people.
It was the intent, but the Jewish people they are the mechanism that God used to display, and people who were intended to be a blessing.
Yeah.
It's so interesting. And here we're going to swing a little bit more towards God's sovereignty than towards free will. They're going to be part of God's plan, whether they realize it or not. And they're enacting God's plan at this moment.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So there's two other Gentiles, and we've already kind of talked about the other one, which was the thief on the cross. We mentioned him really briefly already, I think, who recognizes, there's the two thieves that are also being crucified, and there's one that mocks him, and then the other that's like, whoa.
Yeah.
Do you even recognize who you were hanging against? And then he turns to Jesus and is like, hey, remember me. And Jesus says, you got it, man. You're with me. You recognize even in this desperate moment who I am. It's one other person, and it's Simon, who helps carry the cross.
Yeah.
He's a Gentile, and he's pressed into service because Jesus is so beaten and flogged and everything that he can't carry his crossbeam. Which is a side note. A lot of times there's pictures where he's actually carrying the full cross. That's not actually likely. Most of the time, the high beam was left in place as a constant reminder, and they carried the cross beam over and then took the thing down. And so just a little side note. So he is pressed into service, and we find that later, Mark even talks about, he names his children because later on, he and his children all become part of the movement of the way. So this guy who's just standing on the side watching everything, his life is changed by the encounter with Jesus in the most horrific of times too, and recognizes, and it changes his whole family's tree. And yet, in the midst of all of that, you still have the Jewish people yelling, crucify him, and cheering for what's happening. It's this interesting juxtaposition of what's happening. It should make us as Christians constantly contemplate our actions and where we stand with Jesus and our expectations. Because I think sometimes we think he's for me and he should do for me.
Yeah.
And when he doesn't, I don't need him. It's just also the same idea of do you go and seek Jesus out just when you need him and you're in a situation? Or do you seek Jesus out at all times in the good and the bad? Right? So again, this is why spending time in these passages are really, really important for us, and they should be very reflective. But it's crazy that the people of God can't see.
Well, this is a hard statement for me to make because I'm taking it seriously. As a disciple, if my expectation from Christ is anything other than a cross, then I have the wrong expectation. And I'll be honest, my expectation is other.
Yeah.
It's peace and hope and joy. However, he did promise those things.
Yeah.
He did.
But he also promised the
of
cross.
Eternity, right? So like of
Right.
eternity, not of, unfortunately, not of 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, maybe 90, if you're really blessed, years of life.
Right.
Is a bigger picture of eternity. But Jesus says, you're right, it should be the expectation of the cross. It's just like what, Sandy Richter, my guru, says in one of her studies, and I can't remember which one, and one of the epic studies, she said, when people ask, why is there pain in the world? Why is there suffering? She said, really the better question is, how can there be good? Because there is just a lot of dark. What we should be more surprised of is the amazing goodness that we see.
Yeah.
Why hasn't everything just spun off into complete chaos? Why is there still hope? When you look at humanity's great penchant for destroying ourselves and each other and the world that we've been given to take care of.
Right.
Yeah. Why have we endured?
Right. But what we do a lot of times is we focus on the negative instead of spending a lot of time going, that's the blessing of the good. The amazing blessing of the good.
And the darkness will not overcome it.
Right. when Jesus breathes his last on the cross and it's complete darkness, right? There's this moment where everyone could think, well, there you go, the darkness won. Because that's what in some ways it signifies, to the point here that darkness has overcome light in a time when it should not have, because that's now how God created everything, right? It's not time for dark, although even in dark, there's always light.
Yeah.
You can't go outside in even some of the darkest nights and not look up and see some piece of light. There are some stars somewhere. There is something.
Darkness is not a thing. Only more or less light.
Yeah.
So in that moment, they thought the light of the world was extinguished. But see, so that's the whole thing. Pain, suffering, difficulty, as much as they're here now, eternally, as we're promised in Revelation, they are not a reality. They are a momentary experience, as deep and painful, as difficult as they are in the moment. Eternally, those things, because of Christ, are not a reality, because he overcame them at their very worst. They threw everything they had at him. He took it all and still overcame.
Yeah. And that really, in the end, is what we have to look forward to. So I think that
let's that's a good place to kind of,
we're pretty much,
we could go
done.
So much more. You're gonna have to shut me up here,
But the beauty of all this is yes, it happens the way we read it, and we have these accounts, and they're powerfully moving and somber and difficult and all that. But that's not where we end the story.
No.
Because we end the story, or actually we turn to a new chapter, really.
Yeah, because we're still in the story.
We're still in the story.
We're still in the story.
Today.
It's not over.
But we turn the page, and it's 3 days later, and we get to talk about that next week. So we've got a lot to look forward to, because while it may be dark right now, there is hope, and it's all done. We got great things to look forward to. If you have questions about the crucifixion, if you want to ask us some things about, how did this happen? What is this? Some of the historical things, definitely send us your questions to askgoingdeeper@gmail.com. And we will absolutely address those in an upcoming live or not live pre-recorded Q&A. However it works out, whether we can do it live or not. We will answer your questions, or we will do our best to answer your questions. And with that, subscribe if you haven't already. Share this with somebody who needs to hear the message of hope of Jesus that comes through all the stuff that we're talking about in these podcasts. And I will say thanks for listening. We'll see y'all next week.